Okay, excellent. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next iteration of the SIAH Public Life, the Southampton Institute of Arts and Humanities Public Life Conversation Series. Today, we're very pleased to have Alexander Rehding of Harvard University with us today. And I also have Tom Irvine, who is professor in music, and he's also head of the department in music. He's joining us because he knows Alex's work, he knows Alex, and also it's good for people to see other people other than myself on the screen talking to people all the time. I have to say the Public Life Conversation Series is one of my favorite things I get to do because I get to bring in friends and colleagues and enjoy a conversation and share their insights and knowledge with other people. So it's always great fun. Thanks for joining us today, Alex. The format will be I'll introduce Alex, and then you already know who Tom is, and then we'll launch into some questions, conversation topics, and we'll go for about 35, 40 minutes probably, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat, and we will be monitoring them, and we will then return to them and pick them up as we go through the session. So here we are. So Alex Rehding, all of you have seen the longer bio, so I'll just do kind of like the main information, which is that Alex is the Fannie Peabody Professor of Music at Harvard. He received his PhD from Cambridge University in the late 1990s, and he did postdocs at Cambridge, UPenn, Princeton, and other sites before joining Harvard's music department. He has several books, including Music and Monumentality, Commemoration and Wonderment in 19th Century German Music, which was published by Oxford in 2011, Beethoven Symphony No. 9, which is a lovely little book, very provocative, and you can see a lot of the things that are laid out in Alien Listening very much on the agenda and on his radar at that stage in the Beethoven book, a book that I have used to great advantage. And then Alien Listening, The Voyager, Golden Record, and Music from Earth, which was published by Zone in 2021. So, Alex, welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and good to see all of you and to see a list of names on the side.
Great. So we're going to start with kind of a large topic, and that is in academia, we hear people describe works as a real intervention, as a real provocation, and usually this is hyperbole. But I think in this instance, with the book on Alien Listening, it's not hyperbolic at all. I think this is a true intervention and one that is bound to generate a lot of good conversation, probably a lot of heated conversation, but that's all to the good. And I think what you have done by taking the golden record that was put on the Voyager as a catalyst for rethinking music theory from the ground up, that you and Daniel decided that this was a great area to begin to think about. What is the nature of music? How do we access music? How do we begin to consider some of the shortcomings of music theory, and how might we rebuild it in a way that can speak to and be used by other disciplines and move across other disciplines, which is why you bring in media theory, why you bring in philosophy, you bring in history, you bring in literature, you bring in puns, which I love because they're the lowest form of humor going. And I have a bit of a Tourette's with puns. So it's a really fun read. It's a dynamic read. It's a challenging read, but it's an open and generous read, much as the gesture of the golden record is meant to be a generous offer. So I just thought I would ask you to begin to think about what are some of the different ways in which music and media theory come together in this, and begin to shape some of the ideas that you have running throughout the book about music and about music theory, including repetition, the use of Pythagoras and Penelope from Homer as a way to begin to bring two kind of ancient Greek trajectories, one clearly rooted in Greek theory, music theory, and then another one clearly not, to supplement it and engage it and bring it around to issues of rhythm and how to think about how does music work from a non-anthropocentric position, which is what you would have to do if aliens were going to encounter it. So that's we were talking about capaciousness are us. This is a good capacious opening gambit, as it were. So you can run and do whatever you want to do, and Tom will chip in, and I'll do the same.
Yeah, thanks so much. That is a big question. That is a huge question. And perhaps it's easiest for those of you who haven't read the book if I just talk a little more about what it's trying to do and how my friend Daniel Chua and I ended up writing this book together. Ryan, your summary was so great. And one of the things that might be worth saying is that none of this would have happened if the publisher hadn't been completely amazing, and basically they said yes to all our zany ideas. There are cartoons in it, there is even a transparency in it with more ray figures, and there's a lot of artwork, there's a cutout. It's a very interactive book, and that's one of our strategies that we're trying to use in order to revive an interest in the in principle important work that music theory is doing. And as Ryan was saying, it started out with the Golden Record, and on one level it is a book about the Voyager Golden Record, but it's really extrapolating from that insane project that NASA launched in 1977, where they decided, they were going to send 2 spacecraft into outer space, leaving, to leave the solar system. And they decided, well, if we're doing that anyway, why don't we add a sign that we are here, that Earth is inhabited with more or less intelligent species, and if there is anyone out there, then perhaps they'll pick it up. Perhaps they can even figure out what it is. But at the very least, this round object that's gilded, that's very shiny, is at a minimum, it's a sign that it's a deliberate thing. It's not a random natural object, but it's something that is made, and that part is unmistakable. So, that in itself would be a sign that someone is out there making things, and if they can decipher what's on it, that's a bonus. But obviously, from our perspective, from our human perspective, we are used to LPs and turntables. Well, at least some of us,
we were, yeah.
Our generation are, and so it was a way to think about representation of human culture. How do we use music to communicate to others about who we are? That's sort of the big question that the Golden Record is asking. And obviously, two very distinct audiences. On the one hand, it's humans trying to, figure out who we are for ourselves. And on the other hand, whoever might be out there. And while, the kind of earthbound audience is the more likely one, speaking to this unknown audience that may or may not reside outside the solar system is the more challenging one. And so what we were asking in putting together this book is what might actually happen if someone picked it up at the other end. And the very simple answer is we just don't know, right? Because the options are endless. The very first question we would have to ask is, do aliens have ears?
Yeah.
And the second question would be, do they have hands so that they could handle a record, an LP? And those are not easy answers because, we are very much used to thinking about human bodies, and Carl Sagan and his team, of people who were designing the Golden Record very much had a kind of humanoid alien in mind. And that's very obvious. And they, but that's really not a given. So there are countless ways in which this project could go wrong. And in a way, it's not super interesting to think about all the different ways in which it might not work. But so we try to focus our attention on what would have to happen. So first of all, we know from animal studies on the planet that hearing is very different depending on which species you are. I mean, bats are the most obvious example. Their range of hearing is so much higher than ours that there is really no connection between bat hearing and human hearing. And so, that seems like a very useful way of as a starting point. So we cannot assume hearing in a conventional sense, but we can still assume certain things. Patterning, I think, what's engraved in the golden record are ultimately vibration patterns that are frequencies that can be replicated at the other end, and that's a whole other story about how they would build their own little gramophone player. But assuming all that.
Assuming they get a turntable, yeah.
So what remains when we strip all the levels that make listening specifically human, what remains are frequencies and vibrations that are engraved in the materiality of the record, and that can be somehow extracted at the other end. We don't know what it'll be turned into, and that part is open, but we do know about the frequencies. And so that's really where a kind of post-human and non-anthropocentric music theory would have to start. So it only works at this very, very abstract level. So in this book, it's extremely abstract, but also we're trying to make it very concrete and very fun. Because it's, our hope was that it's not impossible to be both at the same time.
Can I come in for a second?
Of course, I've been talking far too much.
No. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Brian, for asking me to join you in welcoming Alex. It's a real pleasure to see him, if virtually converted into some sort of signal and sent to us. I should add, incidentally, it's not the first time that Alex has visited Southampton, so he came and spoke about this book in the flesh, and it feels like many eons ago in the before times. So we're so happy to have you back. It's such a joyous book, and I think the smiles you can see on everybody's faces, and I hope the smiles on your faces on the Teams call are the same, because it's a infectiously joyful book. But when I was reading it, I was reminded, or rereading it, I was reminded of a phrase that we hear a lot in public discussion about music that really annoys music people, which is music is a universal language.
Yes.
Yeah, and this book seems to me to be a very you and Daniel seem to have intervened on that question in a really interesting way, because isn't it just a question of perspective, right? As far as from the alien perspective, then there is only one Earth music, the one that's on this record. Could you expand a little bit on that? That phrase, music is a universal language, beloved of advertisers and others, the world over.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things about the Golden Record that's really interesting is that it's really well documented. When they put it together, the 6 people who were most centrally involved in it got together and published a book, how they went about it, and what they were trying to do. And so we know a lot of the things that were behind the thinking on the Golden Record. And of course, the question of what music do you put on it loomed large, and they went through various iterations. The very first one was, let's just put all of Bach's works on it, because there's nothing better. And then the next version was one important point is that an LP in 1977 was already kind of outmoded technology, because the cassette tape was what it was all about at that time. And so one of the suggestions was also, let's just put a cassette tape with Beethoven 9 on it. Of course, that's a crazy idea because, you know, in outer space where it's absolute 0 degree temperature and where there's all sorts of radioactive, all sorts of radiation going on, the cassette tape with the, you know, magnetic, you know, with the magnetized tape would not last, you know, a month, let alone the kind of 40,000, 80,000 year journey that the golden record people were envisaging. And so the team around Carl Sagan then started talking to Alan Lomax, the ethnomusicologist and song collector, and said, you know, when you want to represent all of humanity on this record, you should really look beyond Bach and Beethoven, because there's a whole lot of music out there that's quite different. And so they went, you know, they started looking at all sorts of archives of traditional musics from all over the world. And they only had 6 weeks in which they could put this together. They had a hard deadline because the spaceship had to be launched at a particular time when all the planets were perfectly aligned so that gravity would actually pull the spacecraft out in a particular trajectory. And that was really, you know, the window was only a couple of days. So they couldn't move it. They only had this very short amount of time. And so they basically went to Washington, D.C., to the Smithsonian, because they have a big collection of folk music. New York had a couple of archives, but it really wasn't very easy at the time to, you know, get your hands onto music from all over the world. This was highly specialized at the time, in days before the internet. And so within this record time, they came together with all sorts of musical traditions. I mean, you know, there are the ones that you expect. You know, there's your gamelan, there is your, you know, Chinese Guzheng music, there is Indian raga. So, you know, all the things that we find in introductory courses on ethnomusicology. But then there are also some unusual ones, and they, you know, a lot of thinking went into this. They were highly specific about what they wanted on their golden record. I mean, you know, there are countless anecdotes. I don't want to go into it too much, but this is obviously also the time of the Cold War, the 1970s. And so they were very eager to represent the Soviet Union in some ways because they didn't want the project to be some American thing. And so they actually, their first idea was that they wanted to get the, you know, tenor Nikolai Gedda, who sort of specialized in the Russian repertoire, and it was a big deal in the 1970s. But then they found that he was actually born and raised in Sweden, so he was insufficiently authentic. And so they asked their counterparts at the Academy of Sciences in Moscow to ask, you know, at the Kremlin what they wanted to have included. And so the Kremlin came back and said, we would like this folk song called Podmoskovny Vechera, which is sort of, you know, it's not a real folk song. It sort of became one, but it started its life in a propaganda movie from the 1940s. And so, you know, the team around Sagan was like, you know, that's not really what we want. And so in the end, Russia is not represented at all on the golden record, but I mean, unless you count Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, but you know, that was it. I think of it more as a French work, but tradition, in terms of traditional musics, you have Georgian choral singing and Azerbaijani mugam. So, you know, the Soviet republics are represented, although not Russia itself. But so you can sort of see how the political dimension also had played a really big part in putting this together. And in the end, what they have is, it's not perfect because nothing ever is, but it's a really good representation of various parts of the world. And so, you know, they were highly sensitized to the, you know, politics and identities of the 1970s. But of course, as soon as we remove any knowledge about cultural difference that we all have on our planet, as soon as the golden record disappears into outer space, all these differences fall away, because how should the aliens know what all this means? And it all becomes a kind of indistinguished, mushy earth music. Rather than world music, it becomes earth music, which is more about sameness rather than difference.
Difference, yeah.
And just to come back to the question of universality, I think there were a number of different ideas at play about how music, what music is, what music does. And I think they are really beautifully represented in the various suggestions. So the first one, well, let's start with Beethoven 9. I think that's sort of the romantic idea about music, music as the universal language that, you have it in the text of the Ninth Symphony with alle Menschen, alle Menschen, alle Menschen. That's, constantly invoked. So all humans, all humans, all humans. And we don't quite believe in that romantic notion of universality anymore. And I think, the kind of cultural difference that we have with the different musical traditions already speaks to that there is not one music, but many different musics. The one thing that is universal to all cultures on earth is that they have a notion of music, but what that is quite different. Then the other really, really important aspect that appealed to the scientists in this group is the kind of Bachian notion of music as, as a science, as a kind of expression of numbers, going back to a kind of Pythagorean ideal. And there is actually a paper that was published earlier in the 1970s by another astrophysicist who wasn't, who was somewhat involved behind the scenes, Sebastian von Hörner, who argued that with certain tuning systems, and he was talking about various equal tuning systems, of which, the 12-tone equal tuning system is the one that we use commonly, but there are others possible, 5-tone, 1953, I think, and he sort of went through all of them and their mathematical properties, and suggested that if we use that kind of music to communicate with alien intelligence, they would be able to pick up that these are rational tuning systems, based on specific numerical properties that are not random. They're not random signals, and that's always the issue. You want to make sure that your signal comes through as a signal and not as noise. So that was a major impetus for Carl Sagan to choose music as a mode of communication for the Voyager record. Of course, almost none of the music that is included in the Golden Record is in equal temperament. I think there's only one piece that's, it's Glenn Gould playing Bach on a modern Steinway. That could be equal temperament. Everything else is, at best modified. In, the orchestral pieces that are included are, sort of equal temperament. So, it's dubious how clear that mathematical message would ring out to people who, to beings who aren't already prepped to look for that. But we have these different ideas about what music does and what music is that are sort of, brought together in the Golden Record. In the end, we really have a mix of the three of them. So I said we have the traditional musics, but there's also an over-representation of Bach and Beethoven. Bach, I think, gets 3 pieces. Beethoven has 2 pieces on it. And that was deliberate. They actually tell us why, because they really expected intelligent aliens to act as music analysts, as music theorists, to compare the musical pieces. And they wanted to be sure that they were giving them a basis on which they could make meaningful comparisons. And for them, a meaningful comparison was 2 or multiple pieces by the same composer.
Yeah. Well, you invoked rational tonal systems, and you mentioned Pythagoras and the Big Bang Theory, as you call it, in the book. Could you bring in the other element, which I found incredibly useful and provocative, which is one that also has literary resonance, but also craft and textiles and other sorts of things, which is Penelope.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for drawing attention to the Penelope theory. I mean, Pythagoras looms very large in the music theoretical world, and many of you will know the story about the anvils and the blacksmith's workshop that sort of gave Pythagoras the idea of how music worked and how it was related to numbers. So that has a very strong tradition in music theory, that lasts almost 2000 years. It's also music theory is also a very male-dominated field. And despite the best efforts of the Society for Music Theory, I think the female membership has always hovered, around 25%. I mean, it really is like the engineering of the musical world in many respects. And so we were, when we looked at how our alternative theory would work, we found that it's really very much about ideas of weaving. That we in order to make sense of the vibration patterns, the frequencies, we have to fold the sound waves, we have to weave it in various strands and put it together so that it becomes it becomes a tapestry again. And so as we were going wild with all these metaphors, we realized that this maps on beautifully to a different figure from Greek mythology, from the Greek world, and that's and the figure of weaving becomes an expression of Penelope, that that archetypal female figure who sits at home and waits patiently for her husband to come back home from his 20-year journey home. And so that image seemed like a really fruitful approach that could counterbalance the kind of very male approach to music theory that the discipline had traditionally been taking. And so, hopefully it'll be taken up, and we'll see where we go with the Penelopean music theory. What's nice also is that there are all sorts of as we dug deeper into it, we found all sorts of other associations with weaving. And once you have that image, there are so many things that suddenly click into place that we hadn't really noticed before. So it's been really fruitful and productive to think about music in that way.
Yeah, once you pull that thread,
very good.
It reveals the whole thing. But also, I mean, it connects up with music and music-making machines through the Jacquard loom and other modes of automation, which is, precursors for computation and computational machines. So it's got, and then you've got someone like Colin Nancaro, who's essentially running piano pieces with as a Jacquard loom. Okay, so Tom, do you want to?
I wondered if we could stretch the conversation now a little bit in the direction of the future. We had so Ryan and I spoke to Alex last week to prepare, and Alex shared with us some of the things he's working on. So one of the darker moments in the book is when you talk about how maybe by the time the appropriate alien listener receives the Voyager record, unfortunately, humanity will have succeeded in destroying itself, or maybe the whole planet. And that is a gesture towards the Anthropocene, which is looming a little bit in the background of the book. But I think in the last 5 years, since you probably finished the manuscript, it's become much more prominent in a lot of public humanities, arts and humanities talk. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about, and I also want to bring in a funny line, because there's always a funny line for every dark moment. There are 3 funny lines in this book, and you have a funny line about music theory. What's the point of music theory? And as a discipline, and you say, who adopts music theory to enrich their discipline? The answer is no one.
That's right.
So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about a project I think you're working on that may be taking up that challenge, and it has to do with the Anthropocene.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Tom. And I know that's something that's dear to your heart, and you've been working a lot on this. So I hope we'll hear something from you as well. But it was really a natural progression, right? I mean, one of the things that I just alluded to very briefly here is the length of time involved in this message. That, you know, the spacecraft are super fast. I think they move at 35,000 miles per hour. But that's still very slow in, you know, when we talk about cosmic dimension. And they calculated that it will take, it will take 40,000 years for the two spacecraft to be closer to the nearest star than they are to the sun. So that means they're sort of halfway there in 40,000 years. Yeah. You know, at a point where there might conceivably be intelligent life. So if we imagine that some time span of 80,000 years and then something coming back, that's, you know, it's unclear what the Earth will look like at that time. And that's one of the big disadvantages of using spacecraft. If you had used just radio waves, they travel at the sound or at the speed of light, much faster. And, you know, I think it will reach the nearest star within just a few years. So that could have been with our lifespan. But in any case, so this, you know, this incredible time span that massively outlasts not just our own lifespan, but many generations into the future, really led to the question of, you know, what will the Earth look like in years to come if we send out this message? What is the likelihood of anything coming back to anyone who would be able to do anything with it? And so that's really where my interest in the Anthropocene came from. It really is like a, you know, it's almost a sequel to this. It feels a little darker than, I think, the very hopeful and optimistic Golden Record. But I think, you know, it's also an opportunity for music to make an intervention. I mean, it's you know, I spent last year in Berlin at the American Academy, and when you talk about this project to non-musicians, there's always a kind of little shrug, sort of, you know, music and the Anthropocene, how do they go together? And when I went to Berlin, the strange thing was that no one batted an eyelid. It was you know, like they deeply care about music. They deeply care about climate change. So it makes sense that you would think about those two things together. So this was a really great time, and there's a lot going on. I mean, you know, they have workshops almost on a weekly basis on the arts and climate, and you know, it's this really it feels like the discourse is a lot further, and you know, I think there are a number of projects underway at the moment about, you know, bringing these two together. I think I'm in my work, I'm less interested in questions of representation than in questions of, you know, it's sort of very utilitarian. How can we, you know, how can we use music in order to change our behavior toward climate change? How can we make music, how can we employ music in a way that is most beneficial for human survival? That's a big task. And I think, you know, there is no easy answer. There is no, let's all listen to Beethoven 9 and all will be well. And I think, you know, the answer is there are various ways in which this works. But the you know, the answer that I've been quite interested in, again, is related to questions of time, right? So one of the aspects that I think, one of the problems that we face in the Anthropocene is the disconnect between individual action and cumulative effect, between a kind of the normal cause and effect model doesn't work for the Anthropocene, right? So, I mean, my go-to example is if I get into my big SUV and drive down the road to the baker's, And then, I do that once, it has no effect on climate change. But if 1 million people do that every day, it will have a cumulative effect. But because my individual action seems unrelated to that big thing out there, it's always been very easy for us to say, yeah, it's not my fault. And so we collectively have been shoveling our dirt into the future, as Tim Martin says. And so this temporal disconnect, there's no immediate effect, there is no individual effect. That's something that I think music is pretty good at demonstrating. And there are really long pieces of music that set our that make us think about the future are really useful here. And that can be done in various ways. I mean, I have one gimmicky example that is quite fun. I don't think it'll work, but it's still very, it's still a good illustration. In, when was it? 2017, Pharrell Williams, recorded a song called 100 Years, and he recorded it on one single record. And the record is made out of clay, unburned clay. So it's extremely vulnerable to environmental impact. And he went to a launch party with 100 influencers. No one else was around. He played the record once, just enough so that we know that it exists and that it must be awesome. And then he put it in a safe in a castle in France, obviously. And the safe is mounted just below water level. And it's going to be there for 100 years, from 2017 to 2117, and then the safe will magically open. And if we have stopped the sea levels from rising, then we or the generations after us can enjoy this incredible song that Pharrell created for us. And so it really becomes our choice. Do we love Pharrell enough to drop everything we've been doing, realize the error of our ways, and stop climate change? So that's really the stake, right? What I like about it is that it uses music sort of both as a carrot and a stick. It's the prize that is at the end, and it's the thing that we destroy if we don't work hard enough. So it's sort of like a gigantic Rube Goldberg machine. I don't think it's going to work. I admire Pharrell. I'm not sure that in 100 years' time he will be quite as present as he is now. But it's, what's clever about it is the approach that it argues effectively. The problem of climate change of the Anthropocene was caused by capitalism, and we're using the mechanisms of capitalism in order to solve it. Yes. So, it's at least worth thinking about. Anyway, I'll stop here.
It's a bit like, the large-scale computational models that we needed to discover climate crisis to the extent that we did, as Paul Edwards talks about in The Vast Machine, are the things that also help us to begin to solve the problem, but also create more of it because of server farms and other sorts of problems. So it's both. It's always it's the classic pharmacon. It's both cure and medicine at the same time. Yeah, we should be moving to Q&A now, and we've got a few Qs already lined up. There's a queue of Qs. So I'll turn to those now, and we can take them in the turn that they've arrived, so if that's okay with everybody. Yeah, okay. First one's from our good friend Steph Jones in the English department. She says, thanks for a fascinating conversation. Your turn to Penelope and to waiting and weaving, as opposed to waiting and watching, sounds really thought-provoking. I'm curious to know if you considered other figures or other tropes in her place prior to that, and where that might have taken you if you used something else.
So, I don't think we ever considered other figures because we were so fixated on the weaving that sort of it became really natural to think about, you know, I mean, Arachne would have been another one in Greek mythology, but I don't think we ever went there. I mean, Penelope was, you know, she looms so large, haha, that it's sort of, you know, as soon as we were there, we were just like, yeah, that's it. And so we sort of stopped thinking about alternatives. But it's a very good question. And I'm sure if you think hard enough, there would be other really important models like that.
Well, with the weaving too, as there's the text and the textus,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so there's always this relationship between the act of weaving and the woven object that becomes an important part of how we conceptualize the recording of information, image,
Yeah.
Language, etc.
Precisely.
So I mean,
It was
yeah.
such a perfect example that brought everything together. And you mentioned the Jacquard mechanical loom, and that was also something that we had been thinking about. So it sort of, you know, everything clicked together.
Yeah, brought it tightly together. Yeah, great. Colleague from music, Hetty. Good to see Hetty in the mix here. She says, really interesting talk. Can you talk a bit more about the methodological issues raised by possibility-oriented research rather than past, present, or even future-oriented research?
Oh, interesting. Yes. That's a great question. I mean, it's actually something that I've been thinking about quite a bit in a different context. So maybe I'll just talk about that. I have you know, like many of us, we've been fascinated by AI and music. And a few years ago in 2019, Google brought out a Google Doodle that could sort of, you know, harmonize Bach chorales. You typed in the melody, well, 8 notes, and it would give you a harmonization of it. And I spoke to a computer scientist friend of mine about this a couple of months ago, and her response was, "But that was 2019, so, you know, ancient history." and
Talk about scales.
exactly, yes. And one of the really interesting discussions that arose after the Google Doodle was that it was really bad in terms of, you know, the rules that we teach in music theory, the kind of voice leading rules that we espouse. And I think what wasn't appreciated enough was that the algorithm was working with a probabilistic model that, you know, if we are in situation A, then the next thing that's likely to happen is X. So it didn't work with the kinds of rules for individual voice leading that we use in our teaching, but it's a statistical model, a Bayesian model, that's fundamentally different. And so in that sense, the errors were really interesting because they just, you know, show how the different model works. And so I've been really interested in there is really a tension in the AI community as well, in that there is sort of machine thinking that's very, very different from human thinking at the conscious level, right? At a deeper level, when we talk about neural networks in AI, that's obviously a model that's taken from the way in which the brain itself operates. But the processes are quite different. And so someone like Doug Hofstadter, who was, you know, one of the pioneers in this world in the 1970s, is still digging his heels in. He thinks, you know, AI can only be really successful if it starts thinking like a human. And that's not the way the field is going at the moment at all. But it's, you know, I think that that tension illustrates exactly that difference between, you know, as you say, the possibility-oriented research as opposed to the past, present, or even future-oriented research. So that's probably where it would be going with that.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah, and that probabilistic model, all it really reveals is the model itself in operation.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't really reveal a whole lot about language necessarily. Another one from a former colleague, but still very good friend of the faculty, Peter Middleton. He says, you write that to travel with Voyager then is to enlarge music's definitions radically. As someone who works on poetry myself, I find myself wondering if other fields of aesthetic practice might also be enlarged by imagining alien viewers or readers. Can we extend the anthropocentric perspective, that's easy for you to say, to other arts?
I think the answer is an emphatic yes.
Yes, of course.
If there are no follow-up questions, then I'll just leave it there.
There are no.
I mean, so
obviously, yeah.
I mean, one thing that is nice about music is, a certain part of the old romantic trope that it is a universal language beyond words.
Yes.
Is one thing that makes music special. And one of the things that the Golden Record people were trying to do is to avoid texted music. They didn't always, they weren't always very strict about it, but there is a large proportion of music that is purely instrumental, and that's by design. I mean, partly they were worried about words, which is rather cute in this context, but they were worried that certain things that would be said in the music would be offensive to some listeners. But one of the pieces that they included is still the aria of the Queen of the Night from the Magic Flute. That's that's like the most horrifying text in the history of music.
Yeah.
But so I think that would be one question that you have to address, and right now I'm not sure I feel equipped to answer that question adequately, but yes, by all means, I would be very interested to see how that works. I mean, meters, sounds, those kinds of things I think one can build on.
Yeah, and actually, anything having to do with spectra,
yeah.
You're already getting it with the FFT, with images as well as sound. So I think there's a lot that can be done with that, and even just imagining that otherwise is worth kind of taking on board. George Bowles, who I think Tom knows, says, you briefly mentioned radio waves as another medium that Earth music could potentially encounter other beings in the universe. Of course, our planet has been leaking radio waves into space since the invention of radio, wireless broadcast radio. Was this something you were thinking about when you were writing Alien Listening? Were you leaking? Were you leaking then? Yes.
Yes. Yes, we were. And so was Carl Sagan. This is sort of something that was on his mind because he knew, what we're doing here by sending 2 spacecraft into outer space. Those are 2 shots in the dark. There's almost zero chance of this getting anywhere. And if we wanted to be really good about it, we would have to, have broad messaging using radio telescopes. And at that time, they just didn't have the capacity to do that effectively. It's largely a question of energy. Arecibo at the time was already, a very large radio telescope. I don't know if it was ever the largest in the world. I think certainly now, well, Arecibo is no longer with us, but in China, there is a massive one now. And so there are certainly efforts underway to pick up radio signals from outer space. Carl Sagan toyed with this idea. He wrote a science fiction novel called Contact, which was sort of the counterpart to the Voyager Golden Record project in that, this was about an alien civilization contacting us, and they were using radio waves. And I mean, it's very clever because the radio waves that they send to Earth are a TV program, and it's the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany under Hitler, and everybody is horrified. And then after a while, they realize that no, actually, they have, the alien civilization has no idea what this is, but this was the first international radio television broadcast. So it was the first time that radio waves leaked from Earth into outer space, and so they just sent us back what they received from us. And so, this sort of is the first layer in a very multi-layered message from an alien civilization that teaches them how to make contact with them. And, and Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey have a beautiful love story in the film version of it that's not actually part of the book. It's a great novel. I mean, I prefer the novel over the movie version. It's worth reading, and I think in his science fiction work, Sagan kind of worked through the possibilities that he couldn't work through in actual, in the engineering world, because we weren't there yet. But there's also a second project that I didn't find out until later. I think basically I found about it when Alien Listening was in proof stage. But in 2001, there was a Russian counterpart to the Golden Record, and they used radio waves. So this is a Russian astrophysicist who just passed away about a year ago, Alexander Zaitsev, and he was very much he was pushing very hard for an active engagement in sending out signals to make contact with alien civilizations if they are there. And of course, this is really controversial, right? And a figure like Stephen Hawking would say, no, we should absolutely not do that. We shouldn't give away our position because we have no idea who is out there and what they might do to us. So, but Zaitsev was very adamant that we have to make the first step because otherwise we will never know what's out there. And so he started organizing a concert that he called Tam for Eti, Teenage Message for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And so he brought together a Moscow youth club that, it's sort of unclear how much of it was actually done by those teenagers because it's everything is rather too controlled. They basically compiled a concert program that included a Russian song. I forget what it's called. Один вышел на дорогу, I think. So, alone I walked down the road, which is sort of very fitting. And then it's sort of let's see, it's spring, Vivaldi's Fourth Season. It's the Ode to Joy from Beethoven 9. It's Rachmaninoff Vocalise. It's Summertime, Gershwin. And Saint-Saëns The Swan. And then at the end, I forget another Russian thing. It's probably Kalinka, something like that. And it's performed on theremin. And of course. And so it turns out all the songs are highlighted, for the theremin repertoire. They're all, very melodious. They are all solo songs. There's, nothing too rhythmically challenging. I don't actually know which part of spring they do. I only read the program. I don't. It's not super clear. But the theremin has many advantages. I mean, obviously, you have Termion. The inventor was Russian, went to America, went back later in life, and the signal, the sound of the theremin is also a pure sine wave. So it's very easy to detect as a deliberate signal amid the noise. It's almost impossible to mistake it for noise because pure sine waves are so rare. And so he performed this concert 7 times, moving in 7 different directions. The first, actually, what's interesting is he first tried to get Arecibo to host this event. Arecibo said, no, we don't do that anymore. This is too dangerous. And so he then went to a a radio telescope in Ukraine, and right now I can't remember the name of it. But that's where it happened during a week in the summer of 2001. And he calculated that the earliest, the first recording to reach the nearest star should be there in about 35 years. So if we look at time spans, it's significantly different from the golden record. So it's, it's an interesting project to compare with the golden record, because almost every decision was made differently from the golden record. So a very limited repertoire, very limited sound world. There is no material medium on which the music is stored, but it's the pure sound waves. And it's very, as a consequence, it's very fast.
That speed is really interesting, actually.
Yeah. I mean, that goes with this urgency to get the message out and make contact.
Yeah, sending out good vibrations. One last quick question. There are more stacked up here, but I wanted to get Janice's in here, somebody who is contributing to your volumes, I think. She says, perhaps you mentioned this already, but doesn't Penelope unweave as much as she weaves, which is absolutely correct. How do you see the destructive part of what she does, although it's constructive for her, of what she does as component of the musical uses of the metaphor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at night she unravels what she weaves during the day to keep off the suitors. So, there are all sorts of really important aspects of it. There is also an aspect of unweaving going on, in that, we, in order to reweave it, we first have to kind of get rid of our human-centered notions of how music works, how our ears weave the sounds that we hear. So there is a kind of unweaving and reweaving going on at every stage. So I would, you're right in that, certain aspects of the context, the kind of pursuit of the suitors, the threat that Penelope is under, also the fact that she is at work at weaving a shroud. Another really important aspect. So, not everything is equally important, but you're absolutely right that every act of weaving also implies an act of unweaving.
But that's also the act of evanescence as well, which is required of spoken speech, of music. The sound must go before a new sound can appear, right? Otherwise, it doesn't unfold in time, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, we have shockingly already arrived at the top of the hour, and I felt like we're just getting going, but you probably need to get going. I think you've got a plane to catch. So I'll just wrap up by saying thanks to everybody who is attended and who posted questions, and to make sure to watch the space for further public life conversations. I also want to thank my good friend and colleague, Tom Irvine, and most of all, to thank Alex Rehding for joining us here today and speaking about his work in a way that I hope will provoke further thought, further engagement, and much enjoyment.
Thanks so much. It's been great to be with you.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Really appreciate it. Take care of yourselves.
Bye.